Long before I ever posted anything to YouTube, I had a pretty popular little webpage titled How to Make Lincoln Logs, but it was taken down when I changed ISPs. I get requests on the topic from time to time though, so I've decided to post the page's photos here, kind of like a slideshow, and I'll just read the dialogue to you. Listen as you like, or just mute me and read this as you would a web page. I still submit to you that this is a very efficient method for making these, so please enjoy. Lincoln Logs were invented by John Lloyd Wright in 1916. Just imagine, you've created a product that has become a sensation, a product that will still be widely recognizable a century later, and yet your accomplishment is still overshadowed by your father, who is one of the most prominent figures of architecture in world history. Being that I am the type to appreciate design on a scale both large and small, I'm going to pay homage to the son of Frank Lloyd Wright with this tutorial. I've been to Falling Water, and while I do find it impressive, I prefer playing with Lincoln Logs. Let's start with the equipment you will need. Miter saw, table saw, router table. Obviously, there are tons of different ways that you can go about this, but I'll be using a method that uses a router table for as much as possible. You will need 2 router bits for this, a 3/4 inch straight bit and a 3/8 inch round over bit with bearing. The materials that you will need are very simple, and they can be acquired for around $13, which is enough for one batch. You'll need 1 white pine 1x6 by 8 footer. Big box stores tend to carry number 2 in a big pile, so you can usually get a board like this for around $7. That's what I use for this tutorial. One batch of logs from an 8-foot board will yield 224 singles ideally. That's either 112 doubles or 74 triples or 56 quadruples. I'll discuss appropriate combinations later, but this amount is probably 3 times larger than any set you could purchase, and it would retail for big bucks. I also recommend getting a quart of Minwax Red Mahogany, number 225. The big one isn't really needed, but it is cost effective, and it's also nice to dip the logs into. You may choose another stain type, but I recommend this not only for its nice color, but after 2 weeks the logs have a very pleasant and mild odor. Be careful, another stain may give whoever plays with these a headache, so it is worth another $6 just to get this brand. 1 quart will stain more logs than you will ever care to make, I promise. Let's start by rough cutting 8 blocks to 11 inches long. After rough cutting, square each piece by cutting off another 1/8 of an inch. This is important because later we will be cross-routing, and it is very helpful to be square. You will notice that the logs have an additional 3/8 of an inch sticking over each end notch. I make this end cap slightly heavier than 3/8 of an inch long just for appearance. But this will complicate the measurements a bit, so should you also decide to do this, you can figure out the math for yourself. For this tutorial, we will treat all overlap measurements as 3/8 of an inch. If you have decided to stay with the simple measurements, then you should now measure from your squared end and cut each block to 10.5 inches. Making sure that both ends are square. Now we route. The 3/4 inch straight router bit should stick up out of the table 3/16 of an inch, assuming that you have 3/4 inch material. The route should begin at 3/8 from the fence. You can route both sides of each end, only one pass. While routing, don't worry about the fuzz or the splintering, but go slow through the end of the piece just to try to limit them. After you have the first one complete, check to make sure that the measurements are in order. The routes are all on 3-inch centers, so you should have 8¼ inches in between at this point. I was precise, honest. The pick back on page 6 is just a little bit misleading. After you have done all 8 blocks 4 times each, sand off the fuzz with some 100 grit, preferably with a sanding block. After sanding, make one more pass with the router on each one. This final pass will ensure consistency and make a nice, smooth seat route. And luckily, that's pretty much all the sanding that this project requires. Before we continue, I would like to note that the route depth is a slight modification that I've made to the logs. The logs that you would buy have a deeper route, so they will rest on the road directly underneath them. This stacking arrangement prohibits a log from distributing its weight load on interlocking logs, so the walls will feel wobbly. I found that the shallower route improves the overall sturdiness when building. A perfect log might have about a 1/32 inch gap between it and the log underneath or above it, ensuring that the perpendicular interlocking logs that touch it carry the load down the corners instead of down the walls. I should mention that this modification does add noticeably to the height of a structure after a few layers, so it's worth considering if these are going to be mixed with store-bought logs or not. Okay, that's enough physics. Back to routing. Now we are going to make the two center seat routes. The fence has been moved to 3 3/8 to where the route begins. On the first one, I went in about an inch on each one, just to make sure that they were all centered correctly. Remember, these routes are on 3-inch centers, so you should have 2 1/4 in between. Same as before. We make one pass on all 4, sand off the fuzz, then make the final pass. Easy. Now to the table saw. Sand off any fuzz from the nicer side to run against the fence. Set it to 11/16. Try to be exact, but better to be slightly heavy if anything. This size will allow 1/16 inch of play when the log is locked into the 3/4 inch seat. Cutting is easy until the last two. A push block is nice here. Don't be afraid to go in halfway, stop the table saw, and then flip the piece around to continue. The curved marks will be barely visible, and carpenters like their fingers. If your material is 5.5 inches, you should be able to get 7 logs from each block with a thin curved blade. I use a 24-tooth 7 1/4 inch Freud Diablo in my 10-inch table saw. It's laser thin, razor sharp, and dirt cheap. It's only $10 at Home Depot. Back to the router. If everything went alright, you have 56 big logs without blood on them. Now we use a 3/8 roundover bit with a bearing and a fence, and it's all set in line with a straight edge. The height adjustment is best left to common sense, trying to make the radius begin at the bottom of the seat notch. This should give you 2 distinct lines down the log, which gives it a nice appearance and slightly discourages the log from rolling. Feed each log through with the seat notches facing up and down, as running them through sideways will have a different effect on the route. 4 times on each of the 56 logs is 224 routes, so get to work. This is what you should have. And now we will go back to the table saw for the most dangerous and difficult part. This is rather advanced table sawing, so if you aren't comfortable with it, you can use a bandsaw or just skip this step entirely. I personally don't think it's that bad, but you do need to take a table saw seriously. I cut through over halfway, turn off the saw, flip the piece, and finish it. Kill the power at the last inch so that the blade stops just as it finishes. That way it doesn't pull the cutoff into the blade cavity. If you go slow and think, you will be just fine. Update. A 0 clearance insert is highly recommended here. A thin curved blade, like I mentioned earlier, is also very important here. These half pieces are very handy for bases, and they also double as roofing and flooring. I make lots of them. For one batch, you should cut around 7 logs in half. Finally, we come to the last part of the construction, the length cutting. If you find a 3/4 inch scrap to lock the logs together, it will enable you to cut 6 logs simultaneously. You can then press a 3/8 inch brass bar against this to trace a cut line, and then make the length cuts by using either a miter saw or a table saw sled. Don't try to cut 4 singles out of one of your blanks, it's not worth it. Instead, get 2 singles and a double out of a blank. Use some head scratching so you get what you want. Leave some as quadruples because even though I don't think they sell those, they really open up lots of building options. Also, do not underestimate how many singles or doubles you use. The most useful ratio is really dependent upon what you build, so it's pretty hard to suggest an ideal recipe. You'll probably just end up making more like me. But this is the ratio of sizes I recommend. Now you should note that this ratio will totally vary on what you decide, knots in wood, damaged pieces, etc. It's just a quick reference. Well, that's it. All you have to do now is stain. Sorry, but that is the worst part. It takes quite a while. Dip them, wipe off the excess, and drop them in the bucket, and then resist the urge to play with them for a few days. Now go find a guinea pig, and if you can't locate one, children also enjoy these. These pieces were just the cutoffs from the process on page 16, so they are easy enough to make. And I hope that you enjoyed this one for something different. And I will return next time with something in my more usual format. See ya.